educational, transformational experiences for the next generation of leaders. And so really in practice, what we do is as companies grow, as leaders grow, as your teams grow, there's often drama that comes with that. And if you're trying to create a company or create a team for the first time, there'll likely be some debris as you create this new path. And so what I like to think is that we help companies and teams and leaders cut down on the drama so they can actually focus on their growth. And so we do it in a lot of different ways, which I'm happy to share through some experiences. But in a nutshell, we're here to help.
I love it. And I think that's one thing that Brian and I have talked a lot about over the years is, being a manager is hard. Growing a team is hard. Being partners to those folks is hard. And we recognize that. And that's why we're here for 20 plus years in HR. This is what I've been doing, is helping people figure all this stuff out. And now, right now, and over the last couple of years, it's probably been the hardest it's ever been. And so whether that is, like I said, you're reading the articles about turnover and churn within teams, whether that is reading articles about employees leave managers versus, companies and the stress of they see their managers are under and how that impacts them. And while, your company and the HR team can help create some frameworks, at the end of the day, the managers are the people who are with the employees all the time, one-on-ones, helping them with their work. And so we really want to make sure that managers have the tools that they need to be the role models and to build these relationships with the team members. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is actually building that relationship. Because again, it can't just be about saving them once they've tried to quit. So we're really going to talk about how to build that relationship so you can have those conversations, so that hopefully the retention piece is just a natural piece of it. So first, I want to ask Brian to talk a lot about motivation and figuring out what matters to people and why they're even on the team to begin with, because that usually then leads to why they want to stay.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I appreciate that. And to demonstrate some of these concepts, I want to share a couple slides as we get into it. Before I share any slides and even get into the topic largely around trust and motivation, if you are a manager on this call, I want you to ask yourself something in a reflective way. What am I doing to proactively retain and grow my people? You can extend that to the company too. But given what Karen just said about maybe people leave managers, not companies, it's a question you want to ask yourself often, because intentionally you can build more trust and also build more relationships. So that's what question I'm going to keep coming back to. What are you proactively doing to retain and also grow your employees? Now, the reason I tee this up to start this conversation is because I like to center a lot of conversations around relationships and motivation around the concept of trust. We all know that word. We talk about it kind of casually sometimes, but it's really kind of complex. If you go to any leadership framework or even any book about leadership, it's likely going to be a foundational piece to any leadership conversation: trust. This one is from The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which is a book by Patrick Lencioni. It's actually from his sequel, Overcoming. This is a little bit more positively framed, but trust is the foundational layer. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. And it's something that can be built over time. So to echo this sentiment of trust, I also want to highlight that trust is not a light switch that you turn on or off, okay? It's not that. It's a process. It takes time. It's an investment. I'll use the word investment quite a bit. I wish it was as easy as like, all right, we built trust. There we go. We're done. But it's not like that. And I'll reframe that for you in a moment. Just to highlight other frameworks and ways to think about trust, here's an article that was out in 2019 from a group called Zenger Folkman. They're leadership consultants, very good at what they do. It was published in Harvard Business Review, and I like this because it's pretty simple. What they did is assess different elements that make up trust, looking at lots of 360 feedback reviews. They found 3 key elements that I want to highlight here, and these are very tangible for you as a manager to think about too. The first is positive relationships, or even just relationships, judgment and expertise and consistency. Now, I'm putting this up there because you can ask yourself, again, similarly, what am I doing to proactively build relationships? What am I doing to express effective judgment? How consistent am I in my day-to-day? All these things foster trust, which again, get back to motivation and helping team members know where they fit in. Now, one thing I do want to highlight, takeaway from this article, is that of these three elements here, they all matter. Relationships seem to matter the most in the research. So building that relationship matters the most. What it means is that even though you might misstep or be inconsistent at time as a leader, that if you have a break in character that can be very hard to reconcile, then trust is going to be hindered. That's for sure. Doesn't mean it can't be repaired, but it could have a pretty significant impact. So anyway, I'll post a link, maybe Karen, as we send out this stuff with this article. It's a really neat article, pretty straightforward. And always ask yourself, what could I be doing to do more of these things? Now, the way I do want to frame trust is more in this sense. I like to think about trust as a bank account. And if you look at this smiling kid, curious, intentionally putting a coin into the bank account. I'm sorry, Karen, are you hearing some feedback from somebody as well?
Yeah, I was just about to start putting folks on mute.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's okay. I want you to participate, but I also want to be aware. So back to the picture, intentionally putting coins into a piggy bank, right? So if you think about trust as like a bank account and that you're constantly putting in deposits, maybe you're making some withdrawals too. It's a lot more effective that way. It's something that's kind of infinite. You just keep working on it and trying to maintain it and grow it. So that's the way I want to frame this. Now, back to Karen's point initially about motivation and your role as a manager, why this matters, because if you do not have trust, it's going to be very hard to uncover and extract the motivation for your team and also get them to buy in for why they're there in the first place. So trust is paramount. A couple more slides, Karen, then I'll stop on this, okay? I like this slide because it's something we're all familiar with. And we like to think, even in HR, even as leaders in companies, setting policies, that the above the surface stuff is going to create all this feeling of trust. And it could, it adds to it for sure. But when we're talking about motivation and getting people to really understand their role and why they want to participate and engage with your team, there is so much stuff below the surface that's truly going to motivate people. So one thing I'll pose to you all, managers on this call and leaders, is what have you done to better uncover or discuss or move towards some of these things below the iceberg that help understand motivation and help people understand what belonging and feelings of belonging look like in your company and your team. And if your answer is, I don't know what I've done, it's an opportunity for you. If it's like, I'm already doing some, how could you do more? And then how could you model that for other people? So anyway, this is a nice diagram to say policies and behaviors and all these practices might help foster trust and understand and help with motivation, but you as a manager can really drill in below the surface. Lots of opportunity there. And I'm going to share one more thing on this and a story that highlights the point. Oftentimes when we think about motivation and alignment, we kind of focus on what has to get done, maybe who needs to be where, mostly on the checklist, moving towards the goal incrementally. I think that's helpful, by the way. The what is very important. I think what's hard about it sometimes is we try to build our policies and our motivational structures from that what as well in a traditional format. And we might forget about what people actually want to feel on a day-to-day basis in the activities they're doing. So for example, if I have someone who's motivated to be at the company for our purpose, and I have them doing just mundane tasks all day, I'm not saying they still can't be motivated to be there, but there's probably a combination of what has to get done and giving them activities that would also keep them personally motivated in addition to having the company motivation. So framed another way, if you think about the what as a starting point where we typically go, I actually will encourage people on the call and we'll discuss how to build more towards that why, which is starting with what people want to feel at the company as a team member, as a leader, and then building your policies and frameworks around that. Maybe not explicitly or all of it, but at least parts of it. And let me put this in a context that will make a lot of sense. And here's my picture just to remind myself of this particular story. I once had an employee who was reporting to me who basically said, Brian, I want to learn how to code like a developer. Great, no problem. Mind you, we were in business development and client services, so it was a different approach for this individual. And after enough discussion through some of the skills work, as well as me being a manager who's engaged, we got talking, and I was curious. I said, what is it that is motivating you to be a coder? And she basically said, I just want to make sure that I have a job. Now that's great. Like, but ultimately underneath that is probably some level of security, right? I want some job security that make me feel more confident. If something happens to me, I'll have something to fall back on. So when we get to this idea of security being the real motivation for pursuing the coding dream, then we open up more doors. So taking classes, becoming a coder, that's certainly one strategy to having job security. But there might be other methodologies to feel more secure, whether it's through coaching or other assistance, maybe some mentorship, could be books. It could be just any kind of other work that would help build confidence or more security. So it's not the only way. Maybe it even might be financial. We don't know. But if we only look at the what or the channel, we might be limiting ourselves to really understanding what the true motivation is underneath, which is usually pretty expansive. All right, Karen, that was a lot of information for the group. I wanted to make sure I put it all out there first. I'll stop for a moment and pass it over to you.
No, I think it was great. And we had a couple of comments in the chat around the importance of actually just asking your team what's important to them and what motivates them. And actually, in the follow-up email, we'll share a survey that I've used in the past. And you don't have to use all the different categories, but just gives you a starting point to ask your team what's important to them. And then to your point, asking the why is the follow-up. Delina mentioned, especially in this remote world, like really making sure you feel that connection with the individuals on your team. And once you find out the why, it could also lead to other things like career development. So to kind of keep going on your coding example, maybe they actually find they love it and now they're looking for an engineering job, whether that's in your organization or outside your organization. But now you can even help them further, not just with what they're interested in today, but where they could actually take that. And I think one thing that, we're talking a lot about retention today, and all of this leads to retention. It's also okay if in these conversations, it is time for them to move on and you actually aren't going to retain them, but you're doing it in a much healthier way, a much more positive way. You're going to help them and support that with that transition. So we're going to talk about retention a lot, but it isn't just to retain and keep the body in the chair or the body on the Zoom or whatever phrase makes sense in today's remote world. It's when that makes sense. And then how to have that conversation if it doesn't. And we'll talk about that at the end too. And I also really what you said about the piggy bank piece, because I think we are all human. As much as we can train every manager to the nth degree, we will misstep. Someone will say the wrong thing, make the wrong assumption, have a bad day and not present their best self. And so if you've built the trust, or when you have done that, having the humility and vulnerability to say, I was not at my best in that moment. That did not go well. It didn't go according to plan, whatever the thing is you need to say, but acknowledging that will immediately start depositing back into the bank, because it's going to happen. Like, we're going to make mistakes. Looking in the comments here, joint events across the team to help build that relationship and communication and motivation. That's a great point. So obviously we're talking about managers today, but it's what we can be doing across the organization as well. So they feel, to your point around the why, they can feel reminded why they're with the broader team and at this particular company, not just with you as a manager. Has anyone come up with really interesting remote events? I heard about someone doing a virtual safari the other day. That was probably the most creative I had heard of so far. All right, if anyone has any suggestions, toss it in the chat. Like I said, virtual safari was definitely the most interesting I heard.
Can you give me more details, Karen? What does that mean?
So I think they found either an organization or like a YouTube channel or something that does virtual tours. And so they literally had taken a camera like out into the jungle or wherever they were to do the thing. And then they were doing it, and then they were providing that as a recording for people to watch. And the team watched it together so they could use the chat and chat about all the different things they were seeing in this recording.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But to your point around, being sick of screen time, I've also seen companies do. So one thing Order Groove is doing is, in a way to also like celebrate heritage and diversity, we're going to do a family cookbook. And so we're asking people to submit recipes from their families that either represent their backgrounds, their ethnicities, whatever way they're defining like them. And so we're going to put all that together, which is not online. I mean, not like screen time.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll add one
Okay.
more thing, Karen.
Yeah, please.
Not to be underestimated anymore, but the power of a phone call versus a screen
Yes.
call. So I actually encourage people sometimes to just, if they're on it's a remote, relationship, they can actually both go for a walk together in their respective areas and do their one-on-one, like in a walking meeting. So getting outside, experiencing new things, just a reminder to get out away from the screen. So even just like typical process oriented things like a one-on-one, just go outside and do it on a phone and get
Yeah.
off the screen. And I guarantee it will be pretty close to as effective, maybe more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and especially now that weather is getting better, if you're in areas where winter is the thing, it's also just nice to be like, oh my gosh, we're not like stuck inside as much. Yeah, walking charity is another great one. It's things that you can participate in together, even if you're not actually together. Another thing that I saw, this was actually based on a in-person thing that they then created, as you can now do it as a virtual thing, is so several companies ago, we were a big call center, and this woman had gone to some carnival over the weekend. She was the manager, and she had won like this big floating plastic fish. And she brought it in to show her team just to be funny, like, oh my gosh, look at this thing that I did at the carnival. The team loved it. And it became the thing. Whoever had, so like I said, it was a call center. So whoever had the most calls or talk time or whatever their metrics were that day got the fish the following day, and it like floated over their desk. And it became a thing in this 800-person call center. Like everybody was like fighting for the fish. And so it doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be wicked creative. It doesn't have to be, this whole thing. It can just be this floating fish. And then there are ways to do that virtually too. I mean, I've even seen people in the height of pandemic, they were mailing this little stuffed animal mascot thing they had on their team, and it was supposed to be a surprise. So if I had it and Kyle did something that was really meaningful to me, I mailed it to Kyle, and it surprised him to say like, oh, he got the stuffed animal, the mascot. So even just little things like that can, kind of go a long way. It does not have to be this over complex contests, money, all the things that we sort of naturally go to.
Karen, I'm going to add one more thing in here as well,
Yeah.
based on all this, like going back to the underlying motivation, which we'll talk about more. If people are craving some kind of connection, let's say connection's the motivator, there are so many different ways to achieve that, whether it's through how changing. So the event, the elaborate event could make a difference, right? The significance of it, but even the little thing, create those moments of connection if that's the underlying motivation people have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that ties perfectly into, so, how do we start to get there? There's things that we can do to ask our team, but if this is all built in trust, how do we actually do that in order to lead to knowing what motivates them, in order to lead to building these relationships? Brian, what kind of advice do you have for folks on how to actually build that relationship on trust and respect?
Yeah, I have a lot of guidance on this. I train a lot of people on this actually, because this is not an easy thing. It sounds like, first of all, you all inherently do this probably in some of your relationships. The real question is, how can you do it more intentionally in other relationships? Okay. And so if you think about specific skills or things that you can practice to foster more trust and then get back to that motivational piece, there's a couple of things I will highlight for you. And for those who have gone through our training who are on this call, like this is going to be familiar, but still reinforcing. Let me share a slide real quickly just to highlight a point. The first skill, which I like to really train people on, which might be the hardest thing to ever master, is just the general skill of active listening. Actively listening. And I put this diagram up here because it's a nice little acronym that you can ask yourself whenever you're in a conversation or a meeting. Sometimes we like to talk to make sure we're quote unquote contributing. We want to be helpful. We want to be relatable. And all those are incredible intentions. But if you're really trying to pay attention to the motivation and relationship of the person in front of you, you want to listen in spirit to that person as well as the conversation. It's less about what you might want to get out of it and more about what they want to feel and get out of it. So without fail, listening and practicing that is very, very critical. Most of us listen to ourselves. And the next level beyond that is actually listening to the people who you're speaking with. Now, it's a skill that can be worked on and you can learn about more, but that's the first place I go. Go ahead, Karen.
I just say I love a good acronym because for me, it always sticks. So
Yeah.
I will now never forget that.
I'm glad. Hopefully nobody else will either, right? It's actually funny. Some people walk out of that train, they're like, I'm printing this out and sending it to my family right now. So that's the first skill that I really, and maybe the most important, that is super fundamental to doing anything with trust. Listening will foster more relationship and more trust. The other thing I want to highlight, another skill set outside of weight and listening, is actually questioning. So the way we ask questions, and you can team up that with listening, of course, they work together. Super, super important. Now, journalists and lawyers, they're all trained on how to ask questions in their own way, probably largely a leading way. But if you are really asking questions effectively, this is where coaching and all these skills come in. It's super helpful for not only understanding the person in front of you, but also expanding those conversations. And it's with that expansion where conversations around motivation, career path, and all those things happen. So, and when you listen and when you ask questions that are in service to the other person, again, not in service to you, in service to the other person, you start to move the needle on trust over time. So if I were to ask people, for example, what motivates you? Like what I should be really asking is like finding out what's going on underneath. So give me some examples of when you feel like you've been super motivated at a company. It's not necessarily, all right, they want to feel connection, so I'm just going to come up with these ideas myself. Dig in, expand it, and see what comes. And from those, you start to see patterns and you start to develop relationships. So at a fundamental foundational level, listening and questioning will help you get to trust or more trust, and also help you get down to people's motivations. I'll stop there for a moment, Karen.
No, I appreciate that. And actually, we just had a comment come in and which I love, which kind of ties to a couple of the different things we've talked about, is around what do you need from me as your manager as well?
Yeah.
One thing that I've done a lot with teams at Order Groove, we use DISC, but whatever DISC, Strengths Finders, MBTI, like whatever you use, you don't even have to use a tool, just knowing the personality traits of the people on your team and recognizing where there may be style differences. So what do you need from me as your manager? How can I help you? What can I be doing differently? But then also recognizing that those styles may be different. So how you give feedback may be different than how the person needs to hear the feedback, or what motivates you is not going to be what motivates them. Do they need time to digest things? So really also figuring out or asking them, what is your style? How do you take in information? How do you make decisions? How do you like to communicate? And figuring out where that's aligned and where that may be different, because that difference can break trust very quickly, but can also be very easily fixed once you know that about each other.
It's a great point. I'll just add a quick story. There's someone I have been working with for years, who once told me that his high school basketball coach once asked him how he liked to receive feedback. And he basically said, I can do it two ways. One is I'm very blunt and to the point, be very direct, or I can kind of try to praise you quite a bit and soft pedal it a little bit, and we can just do it over time. My friend's a competitive athlete, so he's like, just give it to me blunt. But the bottom line is that it shows intent to even ask the question, and then it's about the follow through. So I like Dolina's point here about asking them these certain things, and then the follow through on that can go a long way for people. That is a token, a big one in that piggy bank of trust.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up because, one thing that we are going to talk about and I'm going to share in the follow-up email is also, so while this is it's not about saving them in the moment, it's about knowing what's important to them. And one way to do that is to have retention conversations or stay interviews or weave those into your one-on-ones throughout your relationship. And so one of the questions is often, what gets you excited about being here? What's important to you? How do you like feedback? What's a recent win? What's a recent blocker? What level, how is your week been on 1 to 10? What would make it a 10? any of those sort of questions help build that relationship over time. And if there is a misstep or if there's a style gap, those are the places where it will start to come through. So you're asking these questions on an ongoing basis, not just, oh crap, I think someone's at risk, I need to try to save them. I know this about them over time, and I keep asking them because it's going to change too.
Yeah, I think to highlight that point, it's an investment in a long process in a relationship. If you have trust in a really solid relationship, my guess is there will not be many surprises.
Yeah.
If you're getting surprised, it's probably a signal. It's like, well, there could be surprise, like circumstances can change, no question. But if you're constantly surprised, you may want to do some reflection as to what's surprising you. Again, going back to that first question, what are you proactively doing to retain and grow your people? Because that would be a signal for me.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Well, and I think too, the other benefit of us asking it over and over again is that you'll also hear themes and trends from your team that they may not be able to articulate yet, but it's the coaching side of being a manager, is asking them a lot of questions, because that will give you more information that they may not be putting together themselves yet. But I recognize that every time you get frustrated, this seems to be a theme, or this tends to be the driver of that frustration. Is that the case? Tell me more about that. What I'm hearing you say is A, B, and C. So using some of those phrases, which is active listening, will also help them maybe even unearth things that they don't realize are trends within their own lives or their own heads. So what are some other questions that we can help people? So whether we are trying to find out what's engaging them or what might put them at risk in the future, what are some things that managers can be doing to help to actually have those conversations?
Is that a question for me, Karen?
It is. And I was actually literally going to say, or if people have what they do, please throw it in the chat as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that people can do to engage in these conversations. I have a couple slides that will highlight a couple key points I think that are important. So let me go ahead and put those up. Well, I would say, let me start with this. It's a slide that I show when I talk about company values quite a bit. And the reason I put this up here is because making sure that if you're a manager in a company and the company has its values, values are kind of an informal mechanism to really building culture and relationship. And so making sure that you as a leader in the company or a manager in the company also adhere to those values and talk about those values, I think could get people more engaged. That's certainly one thing. The other thing that I would highlight on a more tactical level outside of values, and this is from the book Radical Candor, I like to reference some books you guys have, is really to create meaningful one-on-one time for your people. This is key. And let me start with this as well. If you are a manager who might think about one-on-ones as like you can take them or leave them, and then you sometimes show up and you don't, that is not going to foster more trust, most likely. Okay. So if you feel like you can't commit to them, I would say you're better off not scheduling them. Now, you want to have some, but do it in a cadence that you can really live into and that you can make a meaningful experience. When you're in these meetings, as we've talked about, the listening and the questioning is key. Prompting people on what their challenges are. Receiving feedback, I think, as somebody pointed out already, about what you can be doing more of to help them. And then when you learn that, following through. So this sounds kind of basic, but it does take discipline and it does take energy. And it's actually not easy in terms of resources to do, the energy piece. This stuff is hard, but it can be done. It's like simple in concept, a little harder in practice. The other thing I'll highlight for the folks here, and Karen, hopefully this is helpful, there's also this book around crucial conversations. And I put a heart next to this first one because I can't tell you how many times I am encouraging either employees or executives to move towards conversations about people's careers or even risk or desires to leave the company. What they do is it gets in our head that this is something different, and we start making assumptions about what that means, and the narrative can take over. And then all of a sudden you like drop you drop it. You're like, all right, I'm leaving now. And it's like, you know what? Like if we had actually just talked about this when it first came up, I can guarantee you that it would have been open, uh, more productive. And who knows what the company or you could have found in those discussions to stay there or move into more. So for anybody on this call, my advice and guidance is this: be proactive and model the way for engaging in conversations. If you have a thought or a feeling like, hey, maybe I want to go somewhere else, talk about it with your manager. If you get a feeling that your employee is like having second thoughts about things, you don't have to say, hey, are you thinking about leaving? But you can say, hey, I've noticed like there's some changes that are going on. Like, what's going on? Like, let's talk about it. And how can I be helpful? Just open the door. And I can almost guarantee you most people will step through it. So those are some things that come to mind. And again, these skills of listening, questioning, focusing on the person in front of you, building trust, these conversations are a byproduct of all that work that you've done along the way.
I'm so glad you brought up the I would rather talk about it than not, because that is the hardest thing I think I see managers work on. And look, I get it too. Like I am also a manager, even though as an HR leader, I am also a manager. And having those conversations up front might feel uncomfortable. You might be really nervous about it. You're like, I don't know if I want to know the answer, but trust me, you do, because either you're able to help that person get through whatever they're feeling at the moment. You're able to help them create a better career path, a better experience, whatever the thing is that they're feeling at the time. Or, and then you can have a much healthier relationship as they decide to move on, or as you try to see, and as you try to see what might be available. Because by the way, it's okay if you don't know the answer right now. You may not be able to solve it on the spot, but at least if you start the dialogue, then you can get to a place of solving it, whether that is, I don't have a solution. So we either have to be okay with how it is or we're not, and then we'll continue the conversation that way. But at least it gives you a chance to try to get the feedback and try to figure out if there is a solution. And again, the solution may be that this place isn't the place for them anymore, and that's okay too. But at least and you can help be a part of that. Several times in my HR career, there have been people that are like on the edge, and I see them getting negative. I see them getting frustrated. I see them getting disengaged. They're great employees. They've been there a while. They're good performers, but they're just at their wall. And if we don't talk about it, what's going to happen is they're going to get to the other side and they're going to be negative. They're going to have performance issues. And that's the conversation I'm having with them towards the end of the tenure, which nobody wants, which they didn't deserve. And instead, I was able to say, hey, it feels like something's changed for you. I'm noticing this difference. Are you feeling that? Let's talk about that. Oh, this is like you're looking for something that's no longer here. Okay, let's talk about that. And they are able to leave with a great feeling about us. We still feel great about them. I've even helped people find another job. Like, let me introduce you to some people if this is what you're looking for, giving recommendations. They then refer people to us, whether for literally their backfill or for other people on the team, because the relationship is still there. So I think it's like, I don't know, kids going off to college or something, like you have to let your birds fly every once in a while. It's okay. And that exit difference means so much for everybody involved.
I'll add one more quick story and then just one more thought on that. Yeah, things change for people. They change for companies too. So things evolve. It's impossible to predict. But one thing that you can do is when you have moved towards these conversations and move towards them proactively, not obnoxiously, but intentionally and proactively, you can also be super helpful. I think Delina's comment here is exactly right about studying for exams. This reminds me of an employee I had when he started with me when I was in industry. I like to ask people like, hey, why do you want to work here? And then I would ask something like, what do you really want to do with your career? And in that first conversation, he's like, I want to go back to grad school. It's like, great, let's talk about that. So 6 months in, 9 months in, I'm like, and I know you mentioned like at some point you wanted to go back to grad school. Like, where are you in that process? And he wasn't anywhere at that time, but like 3 to 6 months later, he came back and said, hey, I'm studying for the GRE. And we just talked about his career and how he can help the stuff he's doing today can help him get there tomorrow, and how I could be helpful and how so this just like kind of puts you on a path to having these open conversations right away. And of course, sometimes we have this feeling of like, oh, if they might actually feel in interviews, where do you see yourself 5 years? Well, I see myself as a manager in this place. It's okay if they say something different too. if we don't like kind of get out that feeling that we're judging that response or looking for an answer and actually care about what they're saying, it just opens the door a lot more. Which leads me to one more point, which is that even if people do want to leave and we want them to go where they want to go for sure and be supportive of that, they're also, if they're on the fence and still haven't made up their mind, are likely going to stay because they've built that relationship with you. And that could be beneficial for them, for you, for the company. Again, we don't want, this is not about manipulation. It's about just really building a trusting relationship and building on that over time, and then helping people find their way, both you and them.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that final piece up, because it was making me think about when you get this feedback, what motivates you, what's important to you. I've built the trust with you, what, quote unquote, keeps you here, or what makes you frustrated and makes you question if this is the right place for you. Then taking that and doing something with it. My my biggest heartache in HR is when I put out a survey and I get the feedback back and I think I've done something with the feedback, and people say, well, I'm not doing the survey again because nothing ever changes. I'm like, oh no, that's not true. So really making sure you do something with whatever feedback. And it could be at first, oh, that's really helpful, I didn't realize that, let me look into it. Like, that's totally fine. Again, you don't have to have the answer in that moment, but then do go find something out about it, or try to get additional perspective, or try to get more data points, and then come back to that person. Or that's great that you want to move from client services into engineering and be a software developer. Let me learn more about what it takes to work in that job. And maybe I can connect you with our CTO, and he or she can tell you about what it's like to be in that role. And so do the follow-up with it, because one of the biggest breakers of trust is to hear all of that and then have it stop. Again, you don't have to have the answer this moment, but be a partner then in the follow-up to it as well. Let's see, I'm looking through the chat as well. Yeah, these are whole humans. They're not just like worker bees. It's so true. And it's interesting. I talked about this so much during the last couple of years. Even 10 years ago, I was doing manager trainings of, don't cross this line, and friend versus boss, and like all of that. And while at the root, that is still same in the sense of like, you want to be careful and be able to be objective, we are in a place where we want people to be human with each other. You need to be human and vulnerable as a manager. You want to find out more about the humans that are working with you and what's important to them. And everybody shares at different levels. Like, you shouldn't be their therapist. I'm not saying you need to be their best friend, but recognize that they are a whole human and there's things going on for them. So maybe their motivations change, or maybe something does legitimately become different for them. But if you know them as people, it will be easier to unearth that. Brian, have you seen that shift as well in helping managers understand that balance?
Absolutely, especially during these very volatile and uncertain times. Look, people are at home, so their work is a part of their life, is how I view it. Even though that comes to form for different people over time, but that people are right now, especially with what's been going on in the world, they're at home, there's a lot going on, there's lots of distraction, there's lots of energy being used in different ways. If we are not connecting as people, it's not going to be a long-term sustainable solution in my mind. We need each other. We need more of each other, frankly. And so everything we're talking about today, the skills, the practice, again, asking yourself, what am I doing to grow my people? And then Alexis's point, how interested am I in them, in their personal lives and getting to know them? These are all really valid questions that we have an opportunity to do something about.
Yeah.
So I see the same thing.
And I think it goes to asking the questions and giving the space for them to share, but then knowing where to guide them if needed. So if they are in crisis mode, if, again, you shouldn't be the therapist, you shouldn't even be their HR person. So it's when you hear this go, I want to make sure you know about the different tools or platforms we have, or even if it's something as simple as call your insurance company to see if they can help you find a therapist, if that's what you're hearing from them. So it's really just giving them the space to share, and then if needed, helping point them in a direction to get the help they need. And you don't have to ask every single one-on-one, especially that's where if you do how was your week on a scale of 1 to 10, what would have made it a 10? They may talk about work, some weeks it may have been, something, I've been really fighting with my partner a lot, and so that's just distracting me. Or, the kids had this, or my roommates had this, or, whatever, or it's my team member had this. And so you'll just naturally come out when you sort of ask some of those open questions. So you don't have to feel like you're asking them about their personal life or their mental health every single time, but just giving them the space to share what they need to share that week.
Yeah. You mind if I respond to Alexis's
Yeah,
question
please
just a little
do.
bit too? It's a really good question. It comes up a lot. That line is different for a lot of different people. I think it's important for you to understand as a leader what that line looks like for you, and maybe call them boundaries to some degree. And it's not just to be like, a stickler or this is the way. It's just because you have a job to do also in the workplace. Like, people are there to get results, frankly, and most people want to win, not at the cost of other things necessarily, but you can do both. You can be compassionate, you can be interested, you can get to know your people, you can hang out with your people. As long as we can maintain that accountability towards performing as well, I think those two things run together. So Alexis, my encouragement to you is to really think about what that line looks like for you as a leader, what it might look like for your employees. If there's a gap there, then you can skillfully navigate it, get resources, or just work on that. But you have to be clear for you what's going to work. I know for myself and then other people I work with, they had to figure that out over time, probably from going too far one way or too far to the other way. And there's really no right or wrong. It's just about what's the goal for you. Then how does that line and the boundaries you set align for the goal and for the goal of the company, the team, and that person? A little bit conceptually vague, but it makes it, it's a framework to at least think about it.
Yeah, and just to overcomplicate it, it will also be different for different people. So you can decide sort of where your line is, and then other people will have their own lines as well. All right. So as we start to wrap up, what other questions do people have, or what were you hoping to hear from today? Some advice you're hoping to get that you haven't heard yet?
Can I share a tidbit of advice I got from you, Karen, that's helped me with this exact problem?
Oh, well, clearly.
A long time ago, we talked about specifically tailoring my message to my audiences. And so I built a super secret, not to be shared database with Brian likes this. Sorry, someone walked away. Karen likes this. And I did that, but I also started writing down how our interactions should go. And I need to move. But essentially, you write down not only what do they need to hear from you, but also where does a relationship start and end? And I found that really helpful for me, because I have some people who I can be much closer with because we're on a more equal level. And then I have some people who I have to put up straight boundaries on, very strict boundaries, because they will step over me if I don't. So that's helped me tremendously. It's just delineating that. But like Brian was saying, it's also changing all the time. So I don't have a solution. It's hard.
Yeah, let me add something in here as well. It is hard, Alexis, without question. And everything evolves every day, right? New people come and go in your life, or people come and go in your life. It's really challenging. One thing I would encourage for anyone on the call as well. So we talked about company values earlier as a guidepost and guiding principles for how the people should behave and align the company. If you haven't, Alexis, one thing you could think about is how to define and discover your own personal values and how those come into play with your boundary setting and the relationships that you're trying to build intentionally, because they are enough of a guardrail to keep things aligned, but also they're going to also evolve over time too, as you evolve and your relationships evolve. But that's also a helpful framework and approach that I think could be a guiding light for how you navigate the constant changes. Values.
That's helpful. Thank you, Brian. I'm very intense about my values, as Karen also knows, but I've never thought about how do they apply to my relationships with people. So I'll put some time into that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
What other questions, comments, advice are people looking for today before we wrap up? As people think, I am very adamant that every webinar you attend is very actionable. So we will follow up with a bunch of the book listings, a couple of the references that we made, so that you have that as well as this recording. But we're going to sort of wrap up with what is one piece of advice that if you don't do anything different, or you don't take anything else away, like what's one thing you can be doing differently starting Monday? So Brian, what's one thing that you would encourage people to do either differently or make sure they apply starting next week?
Yeah, so given the still uncertainty in the world and a lot of virtual format for people, obviously I'll continue to default to making sure you're practicing your listening. But if I had to pick a tangible thing for you to like get laser focused on, it's how do you make the most of your one-on-ones and investing in that time that you have with the person in front of you. So if you're thinking of yourself, I do everything I possibly can to make them as effective as possible, then great. I would say do more of that. If you're like most people I probably work with, there's always an opportunity to do something a little bit different. And that comes back to, again, understanding what motivates that person, what's going to make them feel heard, what's going to make them be proactive, and you guys together fostering trust and partnership. So cash in on those one-on-ones, invest in them, use them as a coin for continually building trust.
I love it. Continuous theme. I love it. And then mine actually ties to that is within that time, tell them that this stuff is important to you. And so you're going to be asking them about it. I've really been thinking about this. Your career is important to me. Your engagement is important to me. So I'm going to be asking you more questions about this. Talk to me about it. This is going to create a safe space. I realize we may have to build that safety, but this is going to be something that I want to add to our conversations so that they hear it from you time and time again, that this is important. And then that's a great way too, to also ask for feedback as well as a manager. So ask them, but give them the context about why you're asking them. That's okay too.
It's so important to get that feedback. And build that trust, because I've got so many teams that are remote I'm in UK, you might hear, but I've got so many colleagues and teams that are in different parts of UK, and it's just forming those strong relationships with them, understanding what makes them tick, what do they do, like Alex said, what do they do outside of work, and just remembering that and then phoning them up, said, oh, you did that sponsored walk or that run or that marathon, how did it go? You saw your grandma, how did it go? And they really value that you've remembered that they went to see their grandma, and things like that just really go a long way. And it's just asking them, what can I do as a manager? What do you want from me? I'm not the finished article. What can I do better? Because it's a constant learning and development throughout my career. I'm still learning. So you're never too old to learn. That's how I view it. And take on board critique and learn from it. And as you've mentioned before, it's all different learning styles. So what works for one may not necessarily work for the other. So I ask them, I apply like the VARC, or like, what is your learning style? What do you like from me? How do you learn? And that's really benefited me. But I love these because I get so many points and guidance from so many different people. So thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you for your engagement in it. And one thing I want to add too, it's kind of like my fish story. It's the little things that can truly make the world of difference. I did an exit interview with someone once, and while they had moved on for other reasons, when I asked about their relationship with their manager, they said they remember everything. Like the birthday present they sent to me was because they knew I was doing this thing, or they remembered that I liked this brand of chocolate, or like those things really do make a difference, even if it feels small. So I agree. Like, yes, do all of the things, but those little things truly make a difference. Yes. And I was going to say, it's so funny, like connect with Brian and I, and we'll do our own follow-up, but yes, connect with each other. The peer groups of managers, I personally think are so, so valuable. And I know both Brian and I talk about and do work with managers in groups. And I think that's really valuable because you hear that you share perspectives of others, you hear ideas from others, and you remember that you're not alone. Like y'all are trying to figure out the same stuff. So definitely connect with each other too.
Karen, I just want to highlight one more thing as well. And I want to reiterate the point you made about you moving towards those conversations as the manager and opening up and stating your intent. I can't overemphasize how much of a role you can play in modeling what you want to see from your people. Just stating your intent, why you're doing it. That's a very powerful and frankly leadership oriented way of moving towards these conversations. I love that point. I just wanted to echo it one more time. It's really, it's simple, but it's very, very impactful.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Apologies, everybody. I always have a lot to say. So we mentioned the book Crucial Conversations earlier today, and I assume most people on this thread have read it. If you haven't, it's incredible. But it talks about creating a template for having a conversation and really digging deep to the root of it. And I found, and this might be too intense for some, I do once a month with my team. I tell them, you bring up a topic, whatever you think, what do you think we need to talk about? And then that whole conversation is just me digging and just asking questions to get to the bottom of it. And I have found some very unpleasant company-wide issues in that way, which has been great. Is that too much? Is once a month too intense to have that big of a conversation with people? Do I need to pull back, or is that helpful? I don't know. I think it depends on the person as well. But I'm wondering if anybody else has done anything like that, or how do you get deeper with your employees?
Any thoughts from the group? Or Brian, what would you recommend for a cadence for those kinds of conversations?
It's hard to be prescriptive with those things, right?
Mhm.
Everybody's going to come differently and see the world differently. Some people might have a different baseline where their frustration level just gets built up more quickly and more frequently. Some people might self-solve a little bit more. What I would say is for you, Alexis, is you can present it potentially as an opportunity like once a month to have that time, but you can't really necessarily force it if someone's not there. You have to meet people where they are. But if you do set a frame like, hey, an expectation, once a month, we're going to have our one-on-one. The one-on-one is going to be dedicated to what's going on for you, like your frustrations. And in that session, I'm going to play more of the role of coach and dig into some of that root cause, right? I think that's totally appropriate. And that's for some people, that might be the expectation. They follow it. For some people, it might be too infrequent and you do it twice a month. And for some people, it might be like, a prompt, but they're like, you know what, I'm pretty good right now. And that's okay too. So I think the intent is what matters the most. Again, back to Karen's point, stating what the intent is while you're doing it and presenting that opportunity. I think that's a lot. And I think it's pretty good. And so just go with, again, what's the goal? And that's what construct can you put together to achieve it? That's my opinion. But Karen, feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, I agree. And it kind of goes back to like starting the conversation of, maybe we'll do this once a month. If that feels too frequent or that doesn't feel frequent enough, we can always adjust it. And then both the feedback from the person and also what you're seeing in those conversations. It also might depend on the level too. More junior person, that might be too much. A more senior person might have plenty to talk to you about in those conversations. So I think it's also dependent there too. But I like the fact that you're saying, as a manager, this is important to me. So we'll start off this way and we can adjust it as we go.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, Alexis, because I did have a slide in here on this. I didn't present it, but the listening, the questioning, the one-on-ones, everything you're talking about, it's about, you'll get to patterns over time with the people, with the company. And that's what we're trying to do is, again, be productive and to grow. And the way we do that is through having these open and meaningful conversations. And that leads to more retention too over time.
Awesome. Well, hopefully these were helpful for you. Hopefully it is about retention, but these are all the ways in order to get there. Retention is not a magic wand where you can go, oh, great, I retained all my team. These are all the things you need to do in order to retain them or retain the right people at the right times. So, Brian and I are both on LinkedIn. Brian, is there another way people can connect with you other than LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'll type my email address into the chat function here.
Excellent. And you will be getting the follow-up email from my email address. So you'll naturally get that. Anything else, Brian, for them to think about as they connect with you or ways to work with you?
I just like to echo that your leadership matters. You taking time to be here matters. It's an investment. So keep going. It's very inspiring to have this conversation with you all. Thank you for coming and asking tough questions.
Yes. Thank you so much to everyone for your engagement. Hopefully this was helpful. I'll do the follow-up email probably over this weekend, but if you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to us, and we hope you have a great rest of your Friday. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to Brian.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Nice work today.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.